So our final lecture presentation for the course addresses teaching approaches and instructional issues. And I deliberately left this topic for last because I wanted you to consider this question of theory versus practice. Is second language acquisition a useful discipline alone? In other words, is it useful to understand the cognitive, the age-related, the affective factors in second language acquisition alone, or is it really only useful when it's connected to teaching and practice? And when some of the research that we read and analysis that we do is very theoretical, how can we translate that into teaching practice? So in this presentation, I'm going to focus a lot on the concepts and theories that we've learned and relating those to the theory, to the ways of teaching that we're going to study. So first of all, your book explains historical approaches to language teaching called grammar translation, which existed from the Middle Ages to the 19th centuries. It didn't require any specific skills on the part of teachers. It was just like teaching anything. And this method is often called theory-less. It doesn't have a theory about second language acquisition that informs it, right? It's just teaching language, especially in those days, Latin and Greek. It's just teaching them as like a school subject, something to memorize, not something to necessarily be able to speak or use. Okay, so how did that finally change? It finally changed with some approaches that were based on first language acquisition. So you remember that we studied how first language acquisition has some similarities but also many differences to second language acquisition, and how children learning their first language, have specific features that we might not see in the SLA process. But the first method here that we discussed, direct method, was really based on just copy-paste of first language acquisition to second language acquisition. So the direct method used almost exclusively the target language, the language that people were learning, and it really focused on basic vocabulary and short dialogues. So it didn't really get people very far in their language learning just because what was taught was very limited and didn't allow people to communicate, right, in a lot of different contexts using only basic vocabulary. So in some ways, this sort of exposed the ways in which first language acquisition and second language acquisition are different, and perhaps that second language acquisition needed a different approach. Okay? One of the theories we studied of behaviorism, the kind of idea that language can be learned through positive reinforcement or perhaps negative reinforcement, led to a method called the audiolingual method, as this was explained to be used frequently in the military in terms of training military members to speak another language. The audiolingual method focused a lot on repetition and drills, repeating grammar points, drills that just sort of substituted a grammar point to try to give that positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement that it was hoped would lead to behavior change, the behavior of learning a language. But as behaviorism, as we saw, has many limitations in terms of second language learning, in terms of explaining how people learn a second language learning, right? Behaviorism cannot explain how people can produce a novel sentence, a sentence that no one has ever said before, if everything is based on repeating things that they hear from somewhere else and getting positive reinforcement for them. So that led to end up as a major limitation of the audiolingual method, which is not to say that there's not a place for repetition or drills, right? Or that there's not a place for basic vocabulary or short dialogues, but just that this method alone was not enough to be effective for second language acquisition. Another interesting method was based on our analysis of affective factors and the affective filter that sometimes anxiety and lack of motivation were hurting people in learning a language. So Suggestipedia provided a non-threatening environment with peaceful music and not really drills as much as maybe repetition of vocabulary and sort of peaceful repetition of vocabulary. So unfortunately, although this method had a lot of claims, it didn't seem to work alone. Perhaps because the affective factors alone are not the only factor in second language acquisition. Finally, these are some of the most commonly used methods today in second language teaching, and they're more based on cognitive theories and processing theories. So the first and most famous is communicative language teaching. If you have taken a methods class here at Harper, I'm sure you learned a lot about that. Communicative language teaching focuses on all components of communication, not only grammar, okay? And it focuses on both fluency in terms of being able to produce a lot of language naturally and accuracy in terms of being able to use correct grammar and vocabulary. Very closely connected to communicative language teaching is task-based language teaching. So in task-based language teaching, the method emphasizes the real-world relevance of tasks. So presenting tasks that students need to get involved in or solve a problem using language. Interaction and interactivity are a big part of task-based language teaching. So communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching are some of the most popular and widely used methods today. It's interesting to note that your textbook also emphasizes complexity theory. Complexity or a teaching method related to complexity theory. So remember, complexity theory was the idea that we can't just use one theoretical framework to explain second language acquisition. We can't say it's just cognitive, or it's just social, or it's just grammatically based on the language acquisition device, right? It's too many factors are involved to simplify it in that way. So this theory, in my view, has also led to a teaching perspective called the post method perspective. That has a typo, where where there's not just one teaching method. Just as there's not just one explanation of how languages are learned, there's also not just one way to teach or one method that we should always teach with. Okay, so in addition to these teaching methods, there's also some issues that teachers come across in the classroom, and the chapter discusses how these also connect to the theories we've studied and how they can be resolved. So the first is the focus on form or focus on forms. So this is a question that's posed in instructional contexts. Does communicative language teaching overemphasize fluency to the neglect of grammar? So in probably a typical communicative language teaching, maybe lesson or sequence of lessons, we would imagine seeing vocabulary lists, particularly those connected with some maybe relevance to students' lives or relevance to a reading material. We would see, opportunities for students to practice the language by using that vocabulary, perhaps to play a game, perhaps to interview a partner, perhaps to write some sentences using vocabulary related to their own lives. Those would be some aspects we would expect to see in communicative language teaching. So some people feel that that really neglects the instruction of grammar, that it doesn't, students could produce a lot of language about a topic, but they might be producing it with the wrong verbs, right? Or incorrect forms in some other ways. So the question, which is really an important question, I think, and it's something that that you study in methods and also in pedagogical grammar, is explicit grammar teaching necessary? And if it is necessary, how can it best be structured to support students' learning? So I think this focus on form does have a lot to do with sort of cognitive views of language learning, cognitive theories, as well as processing. How much bandwidth, how much working memory do learners have that will allow them to focus on form while also learning about other topics? Okay. Input, and the theory of input was also very strongly emphasized, and that was the idea that basically what we're learning, what learners are learning, is coming from what they're taking in, what they're taking in the input. So this has given way to at least 3 different sort of approaches or ways of teaching that focus on input. Input enhancement would be calling learners' attention to certain parts of the input. Calling learners' attention to certain parts of the input, which could even be putting those parts of the input in bold or otherwise emphasizing them so that learners will notice them. And the theory is that by noticing them more, learners would be able to take them in more and have them become part of their language learning system. Input flooding is a similar concept, but it's based on providing a lot of input about a certain point, a lot of input using a certain point. So there's so much on perhaps repeating a verb form, like we should do this, should. And then with so much should, people start to internalize that and take it in as part of their interlanguage. Finally, input processing or processing instruction was emphasized in your chapter. I was a teacher in input processing when I was in graduate school. I taught with Professor Bill Van Patten, who's the professor famous for this and highlighted in your book, and I taught basic Spanish. So this was a way that he felt that if students had to pay attention to the vocabulary in a certain sentence, they wouldn't pay attention to the grammar. So he designs activities that force them to, in the input, to pay attention to a grammar point that they're trying to teach. So this was a super interesting method and definitely worth researching more. Okay. Another area that the chapter addresses is corrective feedback. What do we do when learners make mistakes? Okay, when in their production. So some corrective feedback can be implicit correction, like a recast. That's when somebody says, like, I goed to school, and the teacher just says, you went to school? Okay. Or a request for clarification, like, what did you say? Can you explain that again? Or an explicit correction, where the learner says, I go to school, and you say, no, that's wrong. It's an irregular past tense. You should say, I went to school. And with both of these, we're mostly concerned with the idea of uptake. That means when learners hear that feedback, how much can they internalize and use it to correct their own grammar? So again, that has to do with some cognitive and processing factors that we've been studying, as well as probably some affective factors like anxiety. The last couple topics I think are really important to consider as well, but the first is translation, and what is the role of translation in second language acquisition. There was definitely a movement that encouraged people to not use translation or not use their L1 and just kind of think in their second language and move over to that with the idea that the learning would be faster. But now, not mentioned in your book, but mentioned in some of the articles that you can choose to read, is translanguaging. Translanguaging encourages learners to use their first language or other languages as resources, not in order to acquire, sort of a bridge to acquire a new language, not something to be squelched in the classroom. Okay, finally, technology and language learning has gone way beyond what is represented in our chapter. We have translators like Google Translate, written, even audio translation. Artificial intelligence also does translation and can do a lot of writing or grammar correcting for students. And then, of course, some technology is facilitative by providing learning tools that help people learn, or even by providing opportunities for interaction, such as in online conversation partners. So all of these practical uses of language teaching really encourage us to think about how second language acquisition can inform our practice, in addition to, I would say, being a useful discipline by itself.